The damp stone walls of the conciergerie held centuries of whispered despair, but none as heavy, as palpable, as the silence that now surrounded her. Marie Antoinette moved through the corridors not as a queen, but as a prisoner stripped of all title, all dignity, and all allies. The torches flickered in the cold draft, casting shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls, shadows that seemed to mock her fall from opulence to utter vulnerability. Every step she took echoed the finality of her situation. Every chain clinked with a sound that carried the weight of history itself, a reminder that the world she once ruled with elegance now existed only in memory. In her cell, the air was thick with the stench of human suffering, mingled with damp straw and the faint metallic hint of blood that had long soaked the floors, remnants of those who had come before her. The guards watched with faces as unreadable as stone, indifferent to her desperate pleas for a fragment of comfort, for a sliver of mercy, for any acknowledgement that she was still human, and not merely a symbol to be extinguished. Hours blurred into days, yet time seemed to slow to a crawl, each minute stretched taut like the cord that would one day end her life. Sleep was a stranger. The mind refused to release itself from the tightening grip of fear, of anticipation, of knowing the inevitable that waited just beyond the thin bars that confined her to that cell. Conversations from outside, muffled and fragmented, carried tales of executions, of screams, of the revolution's relentless hunger for retribution. The voices of the mob became a specter that haunted the corridors, seeping through cracks in doors, through the keyholes, through the very stones themselves, reminding her that the world had turned against her and her lineage, and that pity was a currency long since spent. In the stillness she replayed her memories, the glittering halls of Versailles, the chandeliers dripping crystal light, the gardens blooming with every hue of spring, the courtly dances, the whispered intrigues. The laughter that once surrounded her like a protective veil now seemed like echoes from another life, a life that belonged to someone else entirely. Yet even as she remembered, a gnawing sense of dread grew within her. For the horrors of the present were far more immediate than the joys of the past. Torture was not always the instrument of her torment. The anticipation of death, the slow unraveling of the human spirit within the cold embrace of her cell, proved a far crueler master. Meals, when they arrived, were scant and unpalatable, a daily reminder that sustenance was no longer a gift, but a tool of humiliation. The guard's eyes, whether averted or fixed, carried a silent assertion. You are powerless, stripped bare, your voice reduced to a whisper, your dignity reduced to nothing. She wrote letters she never sent, petitions for mercy she knew would never reach the ears of those who decided fate with casual cruelty. In these writings she poured the fragments of herself, her hope, her despair, her love, her fear, and yet each page remained confined to the damp cell, a testament to her fading presence in a world that had already moved on without her. Her body ached, not from overt cruelty, but from neglect, the chill seeping into bones, the lack of proper nutrition, the constant pressure of chains that left bruises and sores, reminders that even in the absence of active violence, her captors maintained dominion over every fiber of her being. Nightmares plagued her sleep when she dared to close her eyes, vivid and horrifying visions of the guillotine waiting just beyond her sight, of the faces of those who would celebrate her end, of the echoing laughter of a populace intoxicated with vengeance. She tried to console herself with prayer, with the faint recollection of faith. Yet even God seemed distant in those shadowed corridors, silent against the tide of revolution that had swallowed entire generations. She overheard the whispers of fellow prisoners, their own stories of torment, the cries that erupted through the walls in agony, the resignations, the confessions wrung from desperation, and the quiet deaths that passed unnoticed. Each tale became a mirror of her own anticipated fate, reinforcing the claustrophobic certainty that no mercy awaited behind the towering walls of the prison. Guards would sometimes deliver her only brief fragments of news, cryptic messages of the outside world in which everything she had known had been reduced to ash. The streets outside teemed with those who had once bowed at her presence, now consumed with fervor to see her humbled, dethroned, and extinguished. Her family, scattered and powerless, became another weight upon her conscience, as she imagined their suffering, their fear, their desperation to intercede, knowing that no intervention could pierce the tide of political wrath that carried her toward inevitable doom. In the solitude of her cell, she conversed with shadows, speaking aloud to the faint outlines of herself she could conjure, bargaining with memory, bargaining with fear, bargaining with the inexorable march of time that led only to one conclusion. Occasionally she glimpsed the executioners as they passed in the halls, their faces masks of routine efficiency, eyes void of empathy, hands steady, instruments sharp. The guillotine awaited, a cold monolith of finality, silent yet screaming in promise, a reminder that justice or vengeance was impersonal, inevitable, and absolute. Days merged with nights in a rhythm dictated by confinement, fear, and the slow erosion of spirit. Each knock on her cell door, each step along the corridor, each voice from the outside could signal reprieve or herald the arrival of doom. The uncertainty was a torment in itself, a psychological blade that cut deeper than any physical lash, a relentless reminder that control had been stripped from her entirely. Within these walls, the queen became a shadow of her former self, her identity reduced to a collection of fears, memories, and fleeting hopes. She counted moments in small rituals, clung to tiny acts of control, a folded sheet, a whispered prayer, a letter she might never send. Yet all were futile, offering only temporary reprieve from the gnawing certainty that the end drew nearer. And as the days passed, the reality crystallized. The wheel of history had turned, and she was to be crushed beneath it, her suffering a footnote in the broader narrative of revolution, her torment emblematic of the countless souls swallowed by the tumultuous tides of change. Each breath she drew was heavy with resignation and lingering defiance, a testament to the enduring human spirit even when cornered by inevitability. And within that fragile flame of consciousness, she clung to the final dignity she could command, the assertion of self, however fleeting, in the face of absolute annihilation. The days had become a rhythm of despair, each indistinguishable from the last, punctuated only by the arrival of the guards or the distant echoes of a populace consumed by vengeance. Marie Antoinette's cell seemed to shrink with each passing hour, the stone walls pressing inward as if to remind her that escape from destiny was impossible. Hunger gnawed at her body, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in her mind, a slow poison that eroded courage and hope in equal measure. She paced the floor, careful not to stumble over the chains that bound her, listening to the muffled cries of the condemned, their voices rising and falling like the tolling of a bell that marked her inevitable approach to the guillotine. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, never a companion. As nightmares and memories entwined, presenting images of her past life in Versailles, the ballrooms glittering with crystal chandeliers, the whispering courtiers, the laughter that had once been her privilege, now transformed into the grotesque laughter of an angry mob, a haunting chorus that followed her into every corner of her mind. She had begun to notice the subtle changes in her own reflection, the gaunt cheeks, the hollowed eyes, the skin pallid beneath the dim torchlight. Her hands trembled, not solely from the cold, but from the constant anticipation of the final act, the slow march toward the instrument of death that awaited beyond the heavy doors. Conversations with the few who dared speak to her became a lifeline, fragments of humanity in a world that had stripped her of all but identity and fear. Fellow prisoners whispered fragments of news from the outside, tales of upheaval, of the fall of the monarchy, of friends and allies captured or slain, and each fragment sank into her like a stone in the chest, heavy with inevitability. Letters she had written, pages filled with pleas for mercy or confessions of sorrow, were torn from her hands, dismissed by officials who saw them only as curiosities or obstacles to the machinery of justice. She realized that control had slipped from her entirely. Even her voice, once commanding in the halls of Versailles, now carried no weight, no influence. In these final days, she was left only with thought, memory, and the unrelenting pressure of consciousness that refused to let her escape into oblivion prematurely. Every noise in the corridors became amplified, the scrape of boots, the clatter of keys, the faint breathing of guards, the whispers of other prisoners, and the ever-present hum of anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the very stones themselves. Hunger, cold, and confinement had reduced her body to fragile obedience, yet her mind remained a battlefield where fear and pride warred with each other, neither granting truce. The thought of her children, separated and vulnerable, added layers of torment she could scarcely endure. She imagined their fate, the uncertainty of their survival, and the cruelty of a world that demanded their mother's sacrifice as a spectacle of justice. Each day brought another encounter with the executioner, brief and clinical, yet loaded with silent menace. His eyes, devoid of emotion, studied her as though she were already a cadaver in waiting, his presence a grim reminder of the fate that awaited her. The guillotine, hidden from immediate sight, became an omnipresent force, a shadow lurking at the edge of every thought, a silent observer of her declining strength. Conversations from other prisoners carried more than words. They carried the weight of understanding, the silent acknowledgement that the end was not negotiable, that pleas were meaningless, that history would judge her as a symbol rather than a human being. And yet she resisted complete surrender, clinging to fragments of ritual, of prayer, of reflection. In the darkness, she whispered memories of her childhood, of moments untouched by politics, by cruelty, by the inevitability of judgment. She recounted the songs her mother had sung, the gardens where she had once played, the innocent laughter of youth that seemed so distant now, almost mythical in its impossibility. These recollections were not merely nostalgia. They were armor, however fragile, against the relentless psychological assault of imprisonment. The guards became both tormentors and mirrors of inevitability. Their casual indifference, the efficiency of their routines, the precision with which they fulfilled duties of observation and restraint, underscored the futility of resistance. Any spark of hope that had once flickered was quickly smothered, leaving only a careful observation of time, a meticulous tracking of moments that might pass unnoticed, a patient endurance of the now. In rare moments of human contact, she felt fleeting tenderness, small gestures that reminded her that she had not been entirely abandoned to the cruelty of history. A guard might adjust a blanket, offer a morsel of bread, or simply meet her gaze for an instant longer than protocol demanded. And in these gestures, the fragile humanity of the world remained, though never fully enough to ease the weight upon her soul. As the day of execution approached, the psychological torment reached its apex. She became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every shift in the air. The anticipation of death, long a distant terror, had become immediate, almost tangible. The mind races faster than the body can keep pace. Thoughts loop endlessly, oscillating between fear, resignation, reflection, and futile bargaining. She imagined the guillotine's blade descending, slicing through not merely flesh, but through the essence of identity, through the culmination of years of privilege and responsibility, reducing a queen to the most basic human vulnerability. On the final night, the cell seemed colder than ever, though the air was unchanged. She huddled within the meager blankets, seeking warmth in both body and memory. Sleep would not come. It was denied by the mind's obsession with the coming day, the final procession, the public spectacle that awaited her demise. She rehearsed each step in her imagination, each word she might speak, each gesture she might make as she faced the world one last time. Her hair, once adorned with jewels and powdered to perfection, had been shorn or dulled by confinement. Her clothing, once luxurious, hung in tatters, a visual testament to the stripping away of rank, influence, and identity. Yet beneath the surface, the inner self remained, fragile but unbroken, a spirit grappling with the cruel mathematics of mortality and history. The final morning arrived with a gray, cold light that filtered through narrow windows. Chains clinked as she was escorted, every footstep measured, every movement observed by those whose purpose was to ensure compliance, to witness the reduction of a queen to a citizen, to a condemned figure of revolution. The air outside the cell was thick with anticipation, the streets alive with the curious, the zealous, the vindictive, and the indifferent. She walked with measured dignity, eyes lowered but mind fully aware of the crowd, of the faces, of the instruments of fate. Each step was both liberation and confinement, liberation from the solitude of the cell, confinement within the gaze of history. As the guillotine came into view, a massive structure of wood and steel, the enormity of reality crystallized. There would be no escape, no intervention, no reprieve. Only the cold efficiency of death awaited. She mounted the platform, her heart pounding, body trembling yet conscious, aware that the final act would strip away all but the most elemental self. The executioner guided her with hands that were steady, professional, inhuman in their detachment. In these final moments, the psychological torment reached its zenith, the clash between the desire for life and the certainty of its imminent end. The blade awaited, poised, gleaming, an ultimate arbiter of history's will. Her final thoughts were a tapestry of memories, fears, regrets, and fleeting hope, a mind attempting to reconcile a life of privilege, error, and circumstance with the ultimate cost demanded by the tides of revolution. And then, with the inexorable inevitability that had been her companion for so long, the world contracted to a single moment, a single sensation, and the culmination of all suffering and anticipation gave way to silence. The crowd, the streets, the revolution, and the corridors of the conciergerie continued, indifferent to the individual who had become history, her torment now preserved only in memory and in the retelling of those who would ponder the human cost of power, vengeance, and inevitability. The echo of her presence lingered in the stones, in the shadows, in the air that had held her captive. A haunting testament to the secret torments endured by royal prisoners before their final moments. A reminder that the machinery of history is unyielding, and that human suffering, both physical and psychological, can endure even in the face of inevitability. And in that echo, long after the blade had fallen, one could still hear the silent insistence of a human spirit grappling with fear, pride, memory, and the inexorable approach of mortality, an enduring witness to the intimate horrors that history so often reduces to mere footnotes.